I often say I lead an organization focused on engaging people in the world of philanthropy, and that includes giving your time and your talent and your treasure, leveraging your testimony and your ties. And today, we have the opportunity to celebrate a man who's giving us of his testimony and his time and his talent. And we want to lean right into the book, but first, just welcome home, Kevin. Everybody give Kevin a round of applause.
Thanks, everybody. And Isaiah, let me start by thanking you for participating in this and leading this discussion. I know it's not an easy task. It takes a little work, so I really appreciate you digging in. And thanks to the library for hosting this event, and to Gabriella. I can't thank you enough for all the hard work that went into this, and we drew a great crowd. This library means a lot to me. Not this particular building, but I can remember many a Saturday afternoon spent in the Hayden Burns Library doing research papers for my Bowles term papers. Where's Mr. McClure? He's there, yeah. It's probably his fault that I was at that library any number of times, and Tip Tomberlin too. But this really is a wonderful homecoming. The audience is filled with lots of friends and family, and book writing, I know, probably seems like a very solitary pursuit, and it is, but it's actually a team sport. And my team is here today, including my wonderful, and I must say beautiful wife, Dina, in the front row. My mom, Carol, my brother, Andrew, my sister-in-law, MJ, my nephew, Devin Martin Sack, lots of cousins and friends. So thanks everybody for coming. I appreciate it. And thank you particularly to my family and friends for all the support over the last 10 years. It's meant the world.
Please offer them a round of applause. So Kevin, we're gonna jump right into this book. What first drew you to this story? Why Mother Emanuel, and why now?
Yeah. Well, I'd written a lot about race over the course of my journalistic career, just partly by happenstance, partly by where I was, partly by my natural interest, and that work had taken me in and around black churches, I would say maybe an uncommon amount of time. And I was sort of fascinated by them from an early age. The music, the spirit, the sense of community, the pure political power that you saw in those churches. So when the attacks happened 10 years and 3 days ago, I think I was deeply affected both as a Southerner and as a journalist. I went to cover the aftermath for the New York Times. I spent the first week working on a profile of Reverend and Senator Clemente Pinckney, the pastor of the church who was the first person assassinated that night. And then I was very fortunate to cover the memorial service that we all remember, at which President Obama sang Amazing Grace. As I was in Charleston covering the aftermath, I also was becoming fascinated by the backstory of the church. The place went back 200 years. It was the first African Methodist Episcopal congregation in the South. And as I learned about the history, it started to occur to me that you could tell a broader story of African American life in Charleston, and in fact, of African American life across the South through this one institution, sort of all within its four walls. The other thing that was occurring to me was, you'll all remember that 2 days after the shootings, there was a bond hearing at which 5 family members of the victims trooped up to the microphone one after the next. They didn't even know that they were going to be asked to speak that day. But the judge afforded them an opportunity to have a few words, and one after the next, they all offered expressions of forgiveness of one kind or another towards this utterly unrepentant, remorseless, white supremacist mass murderer who had only fewer than 48 hours earlier had destroyed their lives. And that both awed me and befuddled me, I think, like a lot of us. And as I started to think about where that came from and how that had happened, I started to feel that maybe if there was an answer to be found, it was within the history of this congregation and of the denomination. And that's really what set me off on the search.
So let's widen the lens a bit. You had been covering, you just named covering national stories, and this is a hyper-local story. How did your Jacksonville roots or your Southern roots or any other thing between your Southern roots and where you landed at the New York Times tried to shape the lens through which you began to write and lean into this story?
Well, I think the time that I had spent in black churches gave me a real appreciation for the depth of the desecration that had been committed in that fellowship hall. It was immediately apparent to me that this was not just this was not a killing without a message, and that I thought it actually mattered that this perpetrator had chosen this place as his target. I thought people ought to understand why it mattered, why this particular church was so important. And I also thought that it was important that the church not be forever known only for what happened that night. But yeah, my background had placed me in the setting of black and integrated churches time after time after time across my career. I started out at the Atlanta newspapers at a point when the city's governance was transitioning from white to black. And so I spent a lot of time around guys like Andy Young, a minister, Hosea Williams, a minister, Joseph Lowry, John Lewis, Julian Bond, you know. And that continued when I joined the New York Times. In the year 2000, we did a series that wound up winning a Pulitzer Prize called How Races Lived in America, in which 15 different reporters were sent out to assess where the country stood in terms of its race relations at the turn of the millennium. And each of us was to find a different setting or a different interracial relationship of some kind to embed ourselves within and study. Mine was an integrated Pentecostal church in the Atlanta suburbs. And I spent about 9 months there learning about the place and studying the role that race played in the life of that church. That wound up being, amazing preparation for this project.
So the book traces Mother Emanuel Church back to 1818. Quite frankly, you actually go back before 1818. You come all the way in through the Wesley brothers, and you talk about VC, and I'd always said Vesey, but VC. You kind of walk through that history of the church, the oppressed people who were living in those communities. What surprised you the most as you were unpacking this history over the last 10 years?
Well, that it did stretch back so far, and that you could, at every point in the church's life, use the story of the church or of one of the leaders of the church to tell this bigger story of what was going on in African American life, not only in Charleston but across the South at that moment. So, for instance, the pastor who revives the church in 1865. This church really had sort of two incarnations. It was first formed around 1818. Different name, was called the African Church, but it was an African Methodist Episcopal congregation. That church only lasted for about 4 years. We'll probably get into the history of that in a minute. But it revived in 1865 after the Civil War. AME missionaries from the north followed Union troops into Charleston and immediately formed this congregation. The pastor of that church at the time was a guy named Richard Harvey Kane. And as I studied him, he just became this wonderful model or wonderful vehicle to tell the story of Reconstruction, both the great promise of Reconstruction at the beginning and the way that the hopes of Reconstruction were dashed. At the start, he rides into Charleston, he assumes the pulpit of this church, and he uses it as this remarkable springboard into business, publishing. He buys a newspaper, and eventually politics. Runs for the state legislature and wins, and eventually runs for Congress and wins 2 terms. He's one of 16 African-American Republicans who are elected to Congress during Reconstruction. And then as Reconstruction fades, his power diminishes, he loses election, he retreats back into the church. And so he's just an example of, when you say what surprised you most, I think I went into the project with this theory, and it really was just a theory, that I could tell this broader story through the church. I continued to be surprised, day after day, by how much the theory proved true. That at every moment, every important moment, there was something going on in the history of this church that illuminated the bigger story.
So 461 pages, including notes, 360-odd pages of narrative. There are lots of stories that could have pulled out. The one you just told, the one around the insurrection plot that led to the burning or the demolishing of the first church, the Booker T. Washington moments, just post-Civil War. I mean, there are lots of stories that are buried here, but I'm imagining 10 years of writing this book, there were lots of stories that weren't included. Yeah. How did you decide which stories to include?
Well, I was largely driven by what interested me, and I can only hope that it's what interests everybody else. But there was a lot of stuff that I just didn't know, and I figured, if I didn't know it and found it interesting, hopefully the readers would as well. So Emanuel's an African Methodist Episcopal congregation. I figured in order to explain what it was about, I had to know what African Methodist Episcopal, what the African Methodist Episcopal denomination stood for, what it believed, what its history was. And furthermore, I needed to understand what Methodism was, because the AME denomination grew directly out of Methodism. Theologically, they're virtually inseparable in terms of their history, their governance, their culture. They're very different. And the AME Church grew out of Methodism as a schism, essentially, over racial discrimination in Philadelphia, of all places. So it was in the North that the denomination actually happened. So I thought that as I learned about the development of those faiths, I felt like, well, I need a chapter on the development of Methodism. I need a chapter on the development of African Methodism in Philadelphia. And so the story doesn't reside totally in Charleston. There's a chapter that is in Philadelphia, and there's a chapter largely about John and Charles Wesley, and a lot of that takes place in Savannah.
And that story takes us, obviously, up the eastern seaboard, if you will, from Savannah, back up. But then we come back down to Charleston, this deeply connected community with 200 years of history anchored around this idea of not just religion, but faith. And I think this question of tension between tragedy and forgiveness is something that I think is important for the text of all of you all that read all 461 pages. Wave your hand. You know what? Don't do that. But
just Mom and Dina so far. Mark, Meryl. Okay.
This idea of forgiveness and tragedy is it's an interesting tightrope to walk, because you're in a community that has accepted you in. You were started off as a person who was kind of dispatched to that community to kind of respond to a tragedy. But now you're telling this deep connected community story, deep in the faith and how they see faith, how they live their lives through faith. How did you build the trust? And then with what authority did you lean into writing this story?
Yeah, those are good questions, and the right questions. Through presence, I think, just by coming back and coming back and coming back, staying after the rest of the national press had gone home, which was just, that was just the method that I thought was going to be necessary in order to make this work. I mean, I was walking into this place as a white man in the immediate aftermath of a mass murder, one floor below the sanctuary, by somebody who more or less looked more like me than looked like them. And because of that, I think I approached it from the get-go with I hope I did, with a lot of humility about the things I wouldn't know, the things I would get wrong, and maybe more importantly, all the things that I couldn't feel and experience in the way that the people I was writing about had. So fortunately, I had the incredible luxury of time. I had a generous deadline from my publisher, which I then extended not once but twice, and they were gracious to grant that. But yeah, it just took being there and showing people what I was about. I think when I explained to congregants that my goal here, one of my goals here, was to, as I mentioned before, to make sure that the church wasn't just known for what happened that night. I think that resonated, and I think that congregants really wanted that, and it was important to them. So I think once they understood that, and they only did come to understand that by me being around, interviewing person after person after person at length, being very transparent about what I was up to, that I did gradually start to win people's trust. Frankly, it helped to have the pastor on my side. And I made a point of making sure that he really understood what I was about and staying in close touch with him, answering any questions he had. But in black churches, like in many churches, what the pastor says often carries a lot of weight. That was very helpful.
And that was its own journey in this particular church, provided its very independent nature. But June 17, 2015, 10 years and 3 days ago, the massacre and the story that you tell without centering Dylann Roof offers its own horrifying weight. But as a journalist, how did you balance the respect for tragedy and narrative clarity as you were walking and leaning into this?
Well, it's tough, especially when you get to know these people pretty well, and so you're sensitive to their feelings and where they are in their healing journeys, and you know that everybody's at different points on that path. There's a chapter in the book about him. It's called Judgment Day, and it starts with the notion that the trial, which I covered, was deeply unsatisfying in terms of supplying any answers about who he really was or what drove him to do this. There was some evidence that was significant evidence that was unsealed after trial that had been come out of competency hearings that were closed to the public and the documents sealed closed to the press before the trial that revealed a great deal about his mental state. That included psychiatric reports from both defense and prosecution psychologists and various histories. There was a lot that could be learned that the jury never saw. And I thought that was valuable to know. I also had some direct interaction with him. We exchanged a couple of letters while he was on death row, where he remains today. He's now one of 3 inmates on federal death row after President Biden commuted the sentences of the other 37 from death to life at the very end of his term. So he now is in the company of Bowers, the Tree of Life Synagogue shooter, and Sarnaev, the Boston Marathon bomber. So it's quite exclusive company on death row in Terre Haute, Indiana now. But there was a question that I talked about with editors about, well, how much of him do we include in the book for the reason that you discussed? How, at what point does it become insensitive to talk about him? I'm old school enough that as a journalist, that I think it matters to know who the perpetrators are, and that there is value in trying to understand their stories. I'm not sure that I got to the bottom of it, but I'd like to think that the portrayal that I was able to put together takes us a little bit further than the other ones that came before.
So one of the most powerful themes is the family's choice to forgive, and I know you wanted to lean into this. What did you discover about how forgiveness functions as a survival mechanism for the Black, or in the Black church tradition? And forgiveness as agency is something that I really want you to deep dive into.
Yeah, well, I interviewed all of the folks that forgave. There were 5 family members that spoke at the bond hearing. There was actually a 6th family member, a young man named Chris Singleton, the son of Sharonda Singleton, one of the victims, who had made similar comments the night before the bond hearing. This was literally 24 hours after the shootings. He had been at a memorial service for his mother at the high school where she taught, and a British TV reporter walks up to him and his sister as they're walking out and thrusts a microphone in their face. "How are you feeling?" And he says something along the lines of, "Right now all we're feeling is love, and there's nothing but forgiveness for him from our family." The others had not seen this, had not processed it in any way, but again, they get up one after the next day and make similar statements. In the interviews I had with them, they can only describe this in mystical terms. They have no real explanation for it, wasn't premeditated, wasn't planned. It was God talking, they were merely the vessels. 201, they will tell you that. And 201, they'll tell you that they can't really believe that the words came out of their mouth, that they could never imagine themselves forgiving somebody who had done this and who had had obviously such a lasting impact on their lives. They also, as time went by, started to talk about how the forgiveness they expressed wasn't really for him, that it was for them. And I think that those of us who saw the forgiveness expressed towards Dylann Roof as being for Dylann Roof probably misunderstood its intent, and also misunderstood the place that forgiveness and grace play in the Christian tradition, and particularly in the Black Christian tradition. So when you think back over time of everything that African American Christians have endured over the last 400 years in this country, there has been a lot to forgive and a lot that has needed to be forgiven. And without that ability, they will tell you that it's toxic, right? It eats you up from the inside. The hatred, the resentment, the rage, the fury. So it's really it is a survival mechanism that's been adapted over the years within the Black church, not just the AME church, but others, to get by. I talked to folks who said, yeah, it's the only way that I was able to get out of bed day after day. And in that form, it started to feel to me like it was his own form of resistance. There's a lot of resistance in this book. That word is in the title. This doesn't feel like the VZ Rebellion. It doesn't necessarily feel like B.J. Glover, the civil rights era pastor, marching in the streets. But it's in its own way, they were resisting by, yes, reclaiming agency and taking back some power from the person who had robbed it of them. The one thing that cannot be taken from them is their ability to forgive. And maybe the person who was most poignant about it to me was a man named Anthony Thompson, himself a pastor of a different denomination. He lost his wife in the shooting. She was the leader of the Bible study that night. And he said that forgiving for him meant that this guy was not going to be his lifetime partner. And that made a lot of sense to me.
So I had deep appreciation for the way you unpack the emotional and then the theological core around forgiveness. And I was able to lean in. And I think, and that was the moment where I think throughout the book, you were pretty even-handed in the way you kind of narrated the story. And there was some artistic integrity that was leaned into. And I think I felt a bit of how you were navigating the conflict in that, what you were hearing, and you kind of closed out with a person who said that I didn't immediately forgive. If you can tell a little bit of that story, it will be helpful.
Yeah, well, I think it's important to understand that while the church became known as the Forgiveness Church, and Charleston to some extent became known as the Forgiveness Community, those 6 were not by any means speaking for everybody in town, everybody in the church, not even everybody in their families. And there were families who were deeply, deeply divided over the decision by one family member or another to express forgiveness. So there was then and remains today a real spectrum, a real forgiveness spectrum in Charleston among those directly and indirectly affected. And yes, some real ambivalence by some of the family members, and I devote a couple of long paragraphs in the last chapter to a man named Melvin Graham, who lost his sister, Cynthia Hurd Graham. She was a librarian in the shootings, and he talks about forgiveness for his family being a journey, and that they're traveling at different speeds. None of them have quite gotten there yet. They hope that the day might arrive. They acknowledge that it certainly would be a lot easier if they were dealing with a remorseful perpetrator instead of one who just remains as unrepentant as he could be. He certainly was in the letters we exchanged. So he hopes that one day he might get there. He can't promise that he will.
And so we could spend a lot of time going down into the book, but we also don't want to offer a spoiler for folks who are going to buy it today and kind of take the deep dive or the journey alongside us. So I'll say, I want to pivot a bit to authorship and really talk a bit about you. And I'll say this indirectly. You're a white journalist telling a deeply black story. What internal questions did you face about voice and authority or even trust as you were navigating the storylines in the book?
None to my face. And it's hard to, for me to know, obviously, what was said not to my face. So I can only sort of take at face value what I saw and felt, which was tremendous openness, a very warm welcome and reception across my time there. They really brought us in. I do think it made a difference that I was there so much. I think it made a difference that I spoke at length to so many people and word started to spread. But yes, I mean, I went into this, as I mentioned before, the real sensitivity to everything that I wouldn't know and feel, and in the same way that the people I was writing about did, and with the understanding that there might be folks who would not be open with me, who would not be willing to talk, who might suspect my motives. I want to think that I put in enough work to dispel those suspicions.
And you spent years earning credibility in that community through long research, through engagement with the pastor directly, which you spoke to earlier. But who were the other anchors or guys that you relied on in the church and in the broader Charleston community to kind of get through this 10-year process?
There were lots. I mean, I interviewed over 200 people, some of them multiple times. I did find anchors within the congregation, people that I felt that I could go back to time after time after time and would give it to me straight. There were a couple of guys who served as the church historians. We shared this, bizarre obsession for Emanuel AME Arcana. A guy named Willie Glee, another guy named Lee Bennett. They were just fantastic. There were other people in the AME community. A guy named John Thomas, who was the editor of the Christian Recorder, which is the AME newspaper, which has been around since 1852. It was really useful in explaining to me how the denomination worked governmentally, and making introductions for me, and yes, giving me credibility with various people in the denomination. There were other pastors around Charleston and other AME churches. A pastor named Kylon Middleton at Mount Zion, a pastor named Joe Darby, who was a presiding elder. So I tried to, move around as much as I can, talk to people at different levels of the AME hierarchy, from bishops down to lay leaders of the congregation.
So you admitted feeling present during the shooting news, and your kind of journalistic instincts kicked in. How did that shape your writing? Just going from reporter to storyteller or narrator, like what alarms kicked in, what intuition kind of allowed you to kind of navigate the deeper layers?
I think maybe it really kicked in most during the trial, for instance. which was about a year and a half after the shootings. They were started in December 2016 and ran into January of 2017. And I can't remember if it was on the first day of the trial, it may have been on the second day, but very early on, they showed videotape for hours of video that had been captured by the church security camera mounted outside the door, that both the congregants came in to go to Bible study that night and that the shooter came in. And it caught everything. So it catches people coming and going. You see each of the victims walk into the church. You see the pastor, Clemente Pinckney, standing on the step and holding the hand of old ladies as he helps them down a step out to the parking lot. You see his wife and children. His daughter sort of opens the door and tugs at his hand, trying to bring him inside, and he sort of gently shoves her inside. You see people getting out of their cars, carrying things. You see Susie Jackson, who is 87, getting out with the help of a cane and walking into the church. And then you see the shooter, while the Bible study is in session, pull into the parking lot, into the parking spot closest to the door, and casually open the door and sort of checking his waist pack and walking into the door into the church without any obstruction. And as I watched that during the trial, I was just so moved by how you're watching these people in their last minutes of life. It's all there documented in front of you. And you're watching this kid just, it looked like he was walking into the mini market to buy a Coke, That all painted a picture that the first chapter is almost totally constructed off of those videotapes. So that was a moment, I think, where as a journalist I said, this is incredibly powerful, and what an amazing narrative device that can help me really describe the life of the church just as this was about to happen.
You open the book, the first chapter, the doors of the church are open, and the last line is the doors of the church are no longer open. Right. As we think about 200 plus years of faith and religion in Charleston, we move forward and we think about 10 years and 3 days ago, the massacre that you're describing. And now as we start to bridge the story that you've told to our current reality, you have admitted connecting the story to broader threats. Did you write this to chronicle history or to issue a bit of a warning?
To chronicle history. Yeah, I don't take on the greater responsibility. I'll leave the job of prophet to others. But yeah, I thought it was important that people know this history. And while I could not have predicted what would be going on at the moment the book was released, I do think that it's a meaningful time for this book to be coming out, because I think this history really matters. I think that the history of white supremacy in this country, which is essentially what this book documents, matters, and that we all need to understand it. I think it informs our present. I think we ignore it at our own peril. And needless to say, while I don't think it's a political book and certainly not a partisan book, I think we see a lot of effort now at top levels of government, both nationally and in various states, including this one, to deny this history, to diminish this history, to erase this history. And I hope this book will go some small way towards making sure that doesn't happen.
What key message do you hope readers will carry with them, especially in how we think about civil society and empathy and civic engagement?
Well, their story is one of resilience. What I carry away from my time at the church is just such a deep appreciation for the role that faith has played in the lives of these believers. And that has enabled them to withstand all manner of inhumanity and horror over a 200-year period in the case of this church, over a 400-year period in the case of Black America. So I hope that the message that comes across is one of of continuing struggle and continuing resistance, and that even though dark times may be present, that the story of this church shows that resilience and faith can carry people through.
I think that is a great way to transition to, as it looks like we're going to have some questions from the crowd. Everybody give Kevin Sack another hand.
Thank you to Kevin and Isaiah for such a great conversation. We are going to open it up to audience questions. So if you have a burning question for Kevin, do write it on your paper that was on your clipboard. If you already have it written, please volunteer, and I will go around and collect them. If you are on the inner side of the aisle, please pass it down to make it easier for our volunteers. But we will go ahead and collect them and pass them on to Isaiah. We've got a big crowd, so we will try to get through as many questions as we can, but we thank you all for participating. If anyone over here has a question ready for me,
Do we have any ready?
I know we have
one ready.
Guest, very important question ready. He'll be our first one.
All right. How many days did it take you to write this book? How did you feel when your book got published? Why did you decide to write this book?
Can we not pick one? I have to answer all three. Those very excellent questions are from my nephew, Devin Martin. All right, so 365 days times 10 years, 3,650 days. Does that sound about right? Okay. And what was next? How did I feel when I finished? Was it?
How did you feel when your book got published?
It felt so good. Big box came in the mail. Aunt Dina and I got to open it up. The plumber was there, so he took a picture of the two of us holding the book. Felt really great. And number three, was there a third?
And number three was why you decided to write the book. You touched it a little bit
Yeah,
earlier, but you can lean in.
Did we answer that one well enough? Because I thought it was important for people to know the story of this church after what happened there. Thanks for the excellent questions, Devin.
Thank you for that question, Devin. All right. Could you say more about what it means to stay after the rest of the national press leaves? What do you want from the national press these days in its reporting on race? And is that possible given the fraught nature of journalism at this moment?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I was a little glib there. Obviously, I didn't expect the national press to stay for 10 years, nor could they possibly, nor should they. But that is the place for nonfiction writers and historians, right? To go back and to keep coming back and to try to dig deeper than the press is able to in the immediate aftermath of an event. I gotta say, I mean, I left the employ of the New York Times last fall, and the notion of being in daily journalism right now, to me, is a little bit of an overwhelming one. I have talked to former colleagues and said this to them. I don't quite know how they do it. I don't know. There's just so much coming at you at once. There's so much to parse. There's so much to get through. I did not mind having my head buried in the 1820s during the 2020s. Yeah.
All right, I've got a really good one. I'm telling you, when we finish these questions, you're going to be able to write another book. How has your personal faith been affected or swayed? How has your personal faith affected or swayed your writing as it pertains to racism?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm Jewish, and grew up in Jacksonville, Florida, at a time when there was some real separation here on that count, and think that inevitably drove my empathy, I think, or my interest in the civil justice story. I don't know that I ever, really verbalized it, but I think I certainly felt it, that there was some common cause there. And, I guess I just feel that my interest in race certainly came both from my background here, what I studied in college, and the early parts of my career as well.
All right, I'm going to push a little bit here because if I get through these, then I'm going to be really good. Explain to the group why your dad felt as if you're bringing more. Explain to the group why your dad felt as if some of your writings were breezy.
That's so funny. This is the second time I've been asked about this in a 5-day period, I think, more or less, or a week-long period, I guess. My dad, who a fantastic man, a great lawyer in this town, wonderful father and husband, died 3 years roughly before this took place, and but I say in the acknowledgments that his spirit lives in this book if the reader finds the prose even a little bit breezy, and I say that because that word was his favorite descriptor for my work when he liked it, when he, and I think it mainly I had a tendency to write long, and I think it meant that he had been able to get through the all 2,000 words of what he thought should have been a 700-word story most of the time.
All right. Did you interview any of the leaders of the predominantly white church congregations in Charleston to get their perspective on the story?
I did.
Or the shooting?
Yeah, I did. A prominent Presbyterian minister, a rabbi. I'm trying to think if there were any others. Those are the two that stand out.
Was Cynthia Hurd's presentation damaged during the incident?
No, I don't believe it was, but that's a great question. So what that refers to is Cynthia Hurd, who was the librarian that was killed that night, the only reason she's at the church that night is that she has built a display, almost like one of those science fair displays, on cardboard, that was to be taken to one of the plantations outside of Charleston that was having a history fair in a couple of days. And she couldn't get it to this place herself. She was dropping it off at the church so that somebody else could take it for her. In the display itself is seen on these videotapes of her, from the security cameras of her walking into the church. And the pastor sort of stops her and says, "What's that?" And you can see that they're discussing it for a while. This, like the videotapes themselves, was a great narrative element for me because on this cardboard display, she's got pictures of the church, both old and new, and history of the church and its denomination. And it allowed me in that first chapter, when I'm talking about the people coming and going, to sort of pause for a minute and say, the pastor wanted to see what she had, and here's the history that was told on that display board. I never heard anything about it being damaged in the shootings, and what would make sense is that it would have been put out of the way at some place. But I have to say, I have not seen it myself since. My knowledge of it came from a photograph that I got hold of that was taken of it before the shootings.
So to what extent does the focus on the shooter's individual story allow the broader white community, especially evangelicals, to shirk identity or deny complicity?
Yeah. Well, I think to some extent the whole forgiveness narrative does that. I think that there was a concern certainly among black leaders in Charleston and black activists in Charleston that the expressions of forgiveness had essentially let white Charleston and white America off the hook, that it had in some way absolved them of guilt by association, absolved them of responsibility for creating the conditions that created this monster that walked into the church and did the damage that he did. And I agree with that to some extent. I mean, I think that, I don't think it's the case for all of white America by any means, but I think there certainly were some white Americans who hoped that those family members were speaking for all of Black America in offering forgiveness. And I think it's, it's important for all of us to know that they weren't.
Yeah, and I really meant to deep dive the tensions of redemption and forgiveness and the anger that's at present and remorse from the perpetrator and ultimate accountability. I mean, I think that's something we could talk about for hours.
Yeah, there was a guy who sat in the chair that you were in for an event that I did in Fairfax, Virginia last week, named William Lamar. He's the pastor of Metropolitan AME Church in Washington, which is I think the largest AME church in Washington. And he's quoted in the book citing Bonhoeffer talking about this notion of cheap grace, which is grace or forgiveness without accountability, right? And I spent a lot of time talking to theologians about forgiveness who argue that that it almost, the forgiveness that was offered in Charleston in its own way, even though it seemed so pure to us, it seemed like the purest expression of Christianity that any of us had seen, in fact, it was transactional because they got something out of it, right? It was for them, not for the perpetrator.
All right, what we're going to do right now, because I'm probably going to get in trouble in a minute, I'm going to do just a fire round. You get less than 30 seconds for each of these just so we can get through them. We often hear about writer's block. Did you find that there were times that you were stuck, or did it flow with the passion of the story you needed to tell? And also, did it ignite a desire to write another book?
It almost always flowed. There were certainly pieces of the book that, I wrote and rewrote over a period of years, literally. The first chapter in particular. First two chapters took a couple of years to figure out. I had actually been thinking about another book at the time that I was working on this one, and I've started doing a little bit of research. Don't know whether it's ever going to come to fruition. It's actually Jacksonville based, so we'll see what happens.
I like it. Has there been any long-term impact, positive or negative, on the city of Charleston from this tragedy?
Yeah, great question. Lots. And I would argue that it has been positive, although to some extent largely symbolic. And I don't think those things are mutually exclusive in this case. The flag came down at the state capitol in Columbia, the Confederate flag, as a direct result of what happened in Charleston. The statue of John C. Calhoun, which had towered over Marion Square, the Central Plaza in Charleston, for scores of years as a direct affront to a quarter of the state's population, that came down on the 5th anniversary of the incident, which happened to coincide with the George Floyd shooting. The city of Charleston issued an apology for its role in slavery. And Charleston was the port through which 46% of all enslaved Africans disembarked in North America. Interestingly, the vote was not unanimous. It was a 7-5 vote. But there have been a couple of legislative pieces that haven't come anywhere close to success, including a hate crimes law in the state legislature. South Carolina is now one of only 2 states without a hate crimes law, despite what happened in Charleston 10 years ago. And it did not close what's called the Charleston loophole, which is the exceedingly short background check period for weapons purchases, which allowed the shooter to buy his weapon despite having a prior drug offense. Real quickly, the other thing I will say about it is, Dean and I have lived in Charleston for the last 2.5 years, but we've obviously been there a lot previously. I don't know that it really qualifies me to say, but I do feel like it's a softer place than it was, and that there was a Charleston before 2015 and a Charleston after, and that it's more self-reflective as it pertains to race, and that there are conversations that happen now that did not go on then.
In the spirit of reflections, after having attended the trial, do you have reflections on the judicial system and its fairness?
Well, this trial was very bizarre. Trying to be brief about it, but Dylan Roof sidelined his lawyers, his defense lawyers, very capable defense lawyers, during the second half of the trial. The part of the trial at which his sentence would be determined, life or death. And he did so specifically because he did not want his own lawyers to introduce any sort of psychiatric evidence that might in any way suggest that he wasn't 100% intentional about what he had done. He wanted to be perceived as a zealot, not as a lunatic. And so he represented himself during that phase, and as a result, we learned very little about him. And I'll read the question again. Was I've gone off the rails.
Reflections on the judicial system.
On the judicial, I'm sorry. The trial was, I thought, was very well managed by Judge Richard Gergel, who was in federal court. But because of Gergel's decision to allow Roof to represent himself, as I mentioned before, there was just this real dissatisfaction with what we learned about him that came out of the case. I think the prosecution did a thorough and superb job in putting together its case. It's a little bit like shooting fish in a barrel, I guess. Terrible analogy to use in this case, I guess, because there was so much evidence of every kind. But there was no way to come out to sit through that trial and not reach the obvious conclusion.
Did your research intersect with the production or the producers of the movie Emanuel? Any thoughts on the movie?
Seen the movie and like it, but no, we had no interaction.
And then any intel on the lone survivor? And I actually didn't know that it was a lone survivor, so.
Well, there actually are 5 survivors.
There are 5, yeah.
There were a total of 14 people present. 12 were in the fellowship hall where the Bible study was taking place. The survivors there included 2 adults and a teenager. And then there was the pastor's wife and young daughter who were in the pastor's study. The pastor's wife didn't think that the daughter would sit still through Bible study. So they were in the pastor's study. The kid was watching videos on a laptop. The mom was doing some work when the bullets started flying. And the survivor stories are remarkable. Dina and I were at the 10th anniversary commemorative service on Tuesday that focused on the stories of survivors, including 2 of the family members of victims, as well as Gabby Giffords, who spoke, and the rabbi from the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, who spoke. It was all very moving. That evening we were at an event where one of the actual survivors of the shooting itself, Polly Shepard, spoke. She is a remarkable woman. The pastor's wife and daughter hid under a secretary's desk, literally as bullets whizzed through the wall. One of them close enough that she could literally feel the movement of the air. And the other two adult survivors have incredible stories. Polly Shepard is the one who you may remember looks up from under a table, sees the killer's gun pointed at her head. She's praying. She assumes this is it for her. In fact, in an interview with me, she says that perversely she was thinking that, well, at least I won't have to go through chemotherapy for the cancer diagnosis that she had just gotten. He asked her if he has shot her yet. she says no, and he says, well, I'm going to leave you here to tell the story. The other adult survivor, Felicia Sanders, is the first to recognize the gunfire as gunfire. She screams out, he's got a gun. She dives under the table and drags her granddaughter with her, squeezing the child so hard that she thinks she's going to suffocate the kid, but she's trying to tell her to play dead and to be quiet. And her son has been shot, her aunt has been shot, and yet she's got the presence of mind to rub her legs through the blood that's pooling at her feet, so that when the shooter comes by, he might think that he's already shot her and that they're dead. And it works. She is no longer a member of Emanuel. She now attends a neighboring church.
So I think I'm getting a little bit of the hook, but I'm going to take some privilege here and just kind of get through this last question. And in asking the question, I just want to thank you, because a lot of folks here are going to get the book and kind of dive into it. I did have an opportunity to get the book in advance, and so it's all bent up, but not over 2 weeks. It's because I've been reading it for a bit here. The question is, what feedback have you received from the pastor or members of the church after reading the book? And then I think a last question that I think will be appropriate is, if the members were in the audience right now, what would you hope they would take away from the book?
Feedback's been great so far. I think people are still reading it. The book's only been out a couple of weeks, and it does take a while to digest. So, the people that I've heard from have only had positive things to say. Again, doesn't mean that there aren't less positive things that are being said to others. But to me, everybody seems to be impressed and appreciative. And I guess what I would want the congregation to take away is that this is their story. This is their real story. There are things in the book that dispel myths that I think the congregation assumed were true about their story. I hope they've now got a fuller understanding both of the factual basis for who they are, and more importantly for the spiritual basis, and a deeper understanding through the book of all that this congregation has come through, and that still they rise.
If you all will join me in thanking Jacksonville native, Pulitzer Prize winning author, Kevin Sack, for being with us.